The Renaissance period in history, following the medieval period, runs from 1350 to 1500 AD. There's a stark change. If you look at the medieval and the Renaissance, there is a stark change between the two periods of historical times, and therefore, what happens with education is also very different. Educational goals. What were the goals? What were the purposes of educating young people during the Renaissance? Cultivate humanist experts in Greek and Latin classics and prepare people to serve dynastic leaders. So, two things we can see that humanist experts, a term that comes about to make sure that people understand humanism, humanistic experts in Greek and Latin literature, literature of the time, classics of the time, were in Greek and Latin. And so, to understand that and to develop a humanistic perspective from there, because that was the literature available, it was seen that that is how all humans should behave. Prepare people to serve dynastic leaders. There were dynasties, there were lots of dynasties around the then existing world. And so, how could people serve those leaders so that the leaders would be able to do a better function of their roles and make the subordinates or the subjects happy? Students were male children of aristocracy and upper class ages 7 to 20. We still see that the males are preferred to receive this education even in the Renaissance period. Girls were not yet allowed to get into schools and receive an education. Instructional methods were memorization and translation. Because the texts were in Latin or Greek, if you wanted to learn and become more humanistic, you had to translate those texts into your own language. And analysis of Greek and Roman classics, classical poetry, literature, and art. So again, there's a heavy focus still on the classics. The classics were seen as the key thing to teach one generation to the next, but art comes in here too now. Drawing, sketching, painting, those kinds of things also come into the curriculum now. Curriculum was limited to Latin and Greek classical literature, poetry, and art. So a heavy emphasis on the classics. Still, what those wonderful people had put together and written was seen as the only thing worth teaching. Now we see, or should see at least, that there is a trend moving away from religious texts coming into the curriculum. Unlike in earlier dynasties or earlier societies, earlier periods where we saw quite a heavy emphasis on religious texts also, we now see that trend moving away. Who were the agents? Classical humanist educators and schools like the Lycée, Gymnasium, and Latin schools. Again, schools were categorized based on who they were teaching, what they were teaching, and so the teachers were then selected, and you had to be a classical humanist in order to teach. In other words, what this simply means is you had to have studied the classics, you had to have understood what the classics say, and what human behavior comes from reading those classics, because that human behavior was seen to be important to transmit to the next generation. Influence on education is seen as emphasis on literary knowledge. As we focus on classics and poetry, literary knowledge is important. Excellence and style in classical literature, in other words, the kind of writings you produce and the style in which you wrote, changed. And so different styles and different emphasis and different ways of showing your expressions were introduced. And two-track system of schools. Again, we see here one more time that the two-track system still continues. If you were an elite, if you were an upper class, you got a slightly better education. If not really better education than the other people, of the lower class. Not a fair thing to do, but it did exist, and we can see those influences even today in our own education system.